Okay, so thank you so much for the opportunity of interviewing me regarding the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. And amazingly, it's 48 years ago. So the papers 48 years ago today, on the 24th of July, were blaring out across the nation what was happening in Canberra on the lawns of Parliament House, because there was a huge demonstration on the 23rd of July, and as I said, I was there for it, so it is a first-hand account, but I'm over to you to answer your questions for your school assignment.
My first question is, what was your reasons for attending the Tent Embassy?
My reason was a very strong focus on social justice and on Indigenous rights generally, including Aboriginal land rights. And so when there was an announcement by the McMahon government on Australia Day in 1972 that they were not going to legislate federally for Aboriginal land rights, then that really stirred me up to do something to make a difference. And I really believe that the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was a watershed moment in Australia's history, which has made a significant difference.
At the time of the Tent Embassy, what was the treatment towards Indigenous Australians like?
Well, there was a lot of racism and misunderstanding, and I would say fear of the unknown as well would have been a motivating factor. Obviously, there were lots of non-Indigenous Australians favourable also to Indigenous people, but there was also structural racism, and things have moved on a lot since then, I am pleased to say, although of course we still have some residual racism and discrimination in Australia, and you can see that in the Closing the Gap statistics.
Does anyone have questions?
I just wanted to ask, how did you feel that by using tents, how was that significant to the movement?
It was significant in that it got national and international press coverage, and really there had been a lot of silence in the media about Indigenous issues, although of course the Gove land case against Nabalco, which was lost by the Miliprim people, that did get some coverage, but really the Aboriginal Tent Embassy really put Aboriginal land rights and Indigenous issues on the national agenda and on the international agenda as well. So because they had this tent embassy on the lawns of Parliament House, which today is now Old Parliament House, there were diplomats and press corps from all over the world that were seeing what was happening, seeing this eyesore, as many saw it, right in front of the national view. And so, look, movements around the world for black rights, Indigenous rights, they got to know what was happening in Australia, and they were also, no doubt, contacting their members of Parliament and saying, hey, do something about this situation in Australia. So a huge amount of international pressure came to bear.
Do you have any questions?
Do you think the end result was successful, how it is now today?
That the embassy is as successful today?
Yeah.
Not really, and I think a lot of the things that the Tent Embassy worked for have been achieved, not all of them, but a lot of them have. The Northern Territory Land Rights Act and various land rights acts around the nation, and then later on the native title legislation, etc. Things have moved on a lot. However, I think it's really good that the Aboriginal Tent Embassy has kept a presence there in Canberra even today, because it's letting people know, okay, there's still more work to be done. And I think what we're seeing today, of course, the whole Black Lives Matter movement internationally has enabled the issue of the high rates of incarceration of Indigenous people in Australia to come back onto the agenda. So in a sense, the Black Lives Matter movement around the world has given the opportunity to the Aboriginal Lives Matter movement, which actually has started a few years ago, to get back on the pages of our newspapers and get back into some the conscience of Australians, the thinking of Australians. Think, hey, well, do we have the situation here in Australia that is there in the US? Well, hang on, we do have extremely high rates of incarceration of Indigenous people in Australia. Just a further comment on that, Mendy, is that if you have a look at the deaths in custody, there's no significant statistical difference between Indigenous and non-Indigenous deaths in Australia. Where the issue is the high rates of incarceration, including for Indigenous youth. And so that's why implementing the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody recommendations, which has kind of lost its way, and also getting better targets for the closing the gap is so important. And so I'm really glad that with the closing the gap, they've added justice issues, including youth justice, as their targets. The targets aren't good enough, but at least some new targets have been added with the 2018 refresh. And actually the National Cabinet is in Canberra, is meeting today, and they are considering the closing the gap targets. Okay.
Was all of the nation on board with this movement, or was there controversy surrounding this event?
Oh, there was a lot of controversy because, look, non-Indigenous Australians did not really understand, as a whole, did not really understand the living conditions of Indigenous people, did not really understand the impact of colonialism, or didn't want to face it and didn't want to take responsibility for it. You know, there's more than one factor operating, but look, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was a very much in-your-face kind of thing for non-Indigenous Australia. But really, while there was controversy, and you know, there were even some Indigenous people who thought, oh, those radicals in the Tent Embassy, they don't speak for us. You know, you never get 100% agreement with any group in the community, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, over issues.
Do you think the government today is like helping reclaim like some of the land rights that went like achieved back then?
I don't know that there's so much focus on land rights today, but I think it's a good thing that it has been included in the latest refresh of the Closing the Gap targets. So there is going to be a new push to improve Aboriginal land rights in our nation. So I take some heart from that. Yeah. the Tent Embassy.
Yeah.
Look, honestly, I think a lot of Aboriginal issues at that time were hidden from public view, and the Tent Embassy gave an opportunity for it to come into public view. It was like, here we are, you know, things are pretty bad, we need changes, and we're going to stay here till we get it. And that message started to get out. And I mentioned before that, you know, today is the 24th of July, 2020, 48 years since the papers blared in all over the nation about a huge event on the 23rd of July, even though the embassy was set up on Australia Day in 1972. So people started coming from all over Australia to bolster after that 23rd of July, and the pulling down of the tents, and you know, we were in a situation where we were defending the tents, and the police just charged us and started belting us up. I was taken to hospital with internal muscle sprain of the neck and chest because we were determined to defend the last tent. And so people started coming then from all over Australia. Busloads came from Brisbane, people came from the Northern Territory, reinforcements came from all over Australia until we had the very big rally on the 30th of July. And so the word got out, the support came in. On the 30th of July, some of the Aboriginal leaders were really worried that there could be bloodshed, that there could be violence, and so they met with MP Mr Hunt at the time, and I think they kind of forged some agreement that the Aboriginal leadership would basically allow the tents to be removed peacefully, and the police would allow them to have their protest and not stop it, although rows and rows and rows and rows of police marched in, and some of the demonstrators said Sieg Heil, you know, and we were calling out Aboriginal land rights, free blacks, stop the act, a whole lot of things, and basically singing We Shall Overcome. That was really the anthem.
Did you receive much international help from like other countries?
There were support from diplomats from various other countries. There wouldn't have been financial support, but there was moral support and there was political support. Yes.
Why do you think they give their support to how is it?
Well, you think about it, you've got this huge imposing monolith of Parliament House, and in the front of that you have these tents that spoke of the poverty of Indigenous people, spoke of the powerlessness of Indigenous people, spoke of the even the lack of legitimacy of Aboriginal people in their own nation, although they were citizens by then. So it was a very graphic statement to the world that, hey, you know, we don't have our basic rights. I mean, land rights was the main focus, protection of sacred sites, mining rights, etc. But we don't have our basic rights, was the cry of the embassy. And the white supporters that were there were a lot of them, not just me, was saying, you know, we stand with you, we support you, and you know, some of us were there to the end, and so it was such a watershed moment in this nation.
You were saying earlier that people disagreed with the movement, obviously, but why do you think Indigenous people would disagree with a movement that's fighting for them?
Well, you are always going to get a certain number of people who don't want to rock the boat. Okay, you're always going to get a certain number of people that I guess it depends depends whose eyes you're looking from. So if you're looking through the eyes of radical blacks, they would be saying, well, these people have been co-opted by the system. They've got good jobs, they've got some sort of voice, not a very powerful one, but they've got some sort of voice, they've got an income, they want to protect that, okay? That's part of it. Also part of it is, if you think of the history of Aboriginal people in Australia, it was actually not safe historically to talk up because you could be, for example, just in Queensland here, Palm Island was used as a penal colony for Indigenous people who stood up, answered back to white managers or whatever. It actually wasn't a very safe thing to do. Families were split up because of it. So some Indigenous people just learned not to speak up and were frightened if others of their own people did, because there could be a backlash.
What do you believe were the major effects of the Tent Embassy on social and political structures in Australia?
I think the major thing that came out of it was that we did end up having land rights legislation. So in 1972, basically what happened was that I really think that the Tent Embassy had a lot of effect in putting the Liberals out of government because they handled it very ineffectually, and Gough Whitlam at the time was supported the Tent Embassy. He came into power, and one of the things that he promised was land rights, and the first thing was the Northern Territory land rights legislation. As we know, he was dismissed and then later voted out, and then the Liberal government that came in actually followed up, and they finished instituting that land rights legislation. Since then, land rights legislation has happened in other states. We never did manage to quite get a federal one, but the native title case, the Mabo case, came through, and Prime Minister Keating put in place the native title legislation later on.
How important is the embassy today compared to 1972, and do you believe that Aboriginal youth today are thoroughly educated about the history of it?
Well, I didn't catch the first part, but you can come back to that. But Aboriginal people today, look, I would say the stories have been passed on through the generations. A lot of the Aboriginal leaders and Torres Strait Islander leaders that were there at the embassy, a lot of them have actually passed away now. But I believe their stories would have gone through to the next generation and the generation after them. However, generally in schools, I would imagine that there's not much passed on in schools about that particular history. So I'm really glad as students you are studying civil rights since 1967 in Australia. That's wonderful. And what was the first part?
How important is the embassy today compared to 1972?
No, the embassy today it's more of a relic than anything else. I think it's not having much powerful effect at all. A few people man it, and but they want to keep the fires burning, and so good on them for that. But the embassy did its job.
I think I have everything that I wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be interviewed by you.
Thank you.
And
for helping
good
us.
luck with your assignments.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.